Welcome back to Hoosier History, Legends, and Heroes. This is my 50th video, and because of that, I wanted to do one that was special. I thought about it for a while, trying to decide what I should pick as the subject. And then it hit me. Let me do this video on the only Hoosier who held the office of the presidency of the United States. Benjamin Harrison of Indianapolis, Indiana, was elected the 23rd President of the United States. I'm going to start by giving you some history of the Harrison family, Benjamin's ancestors. The Harrison family came to the New World in the 1600s from England and settled in the colony of Virginia. Benjamin's great-grandfather, Benjamin Harrison V, was a founding father. He was a delegate to the Continental Congress, and he was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was elected as the 5th governor of Virginia. Benjamin's grandfather was William Henry Harrison. He was a military officer and would become the governor of the Indiana Territories in 1801. Holding this office, William lived in Vincennes, which was the capital of the Indiana Territory. After the War of 1812, he would settle in Ohio. He was involved in Ohio politics. He was nominated for president in 1836 and was beaten by Martin Van Buren. He ran again in 1840 with John Tyler as his running mate. If you have ever heard the slogan, "Tippecanoe and Tyler too," it was from this election. William's nickname was Tippecanoe, which he was given after the Battle of Tippecanoe. They would win the 1840 election, and he was the 9th President of the United States. There were those who were concerned because of William's age. He was 68 at the time of his inauguration. His inauguration was on March 4th, 1841. It was a cold and rainy day. William was determined to show that he was still strong and healthy. He would decide not to wear an overcoat or a hat. He rode in the rain on horseback to the ceremony. Standing in the cold March rain, he delivered a speech that took him 2 hours to get through. 3 weeks later, William became ill. By April 3rd, he was delirious. At 12:30 a.m. on April 4th, he would pass away. Things to note about William Henry Harrison's presidency. He was the last president who was born before America had won her independence. He gave the longest inaugural speech in history. He served the shortest time as president, and he was the first president who died in office. Our Benjamin Harrison was born on August 20th, 1833, to John Scott Harrison and Elizabeth Irwin Harrison. He was born at the home of his grandfather, William Henry Harrison, on his farm in North Bend, Ohio. His father, John Scott Harrison, was born in Vincennes in 1804 during his father's time as the governor of the Indiana Territory. John Scott would own a farm next to his father's in Ohio and would serve 2 terms in Congress. Benjamin's father was a farmer in North Bend, Ohio. It is said that on the front porch of the Harrison home, the family could watch flatboats and steamships moving along the Ohio River. His early schooling was in a log cabin school. When Benjamin was 14, he and his older brother Irwin were sent to a boarding school in Cincinnati. One of his teachers was Reverend John Scott, a Presbyterian minister, and it just so happened that Reverend John Scott had an attractive daughter named Caroline, with the nickname of Carrie, and she and Benjamin became friends. In the summer of 1850, Benjamin's mother passed away. At one time, his father had thought of possibly sending Benjamin to Yale, but after the death of his mother, the decision was made to keep him closer to home, and he would go to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, about 40 miles from North Bend. And guess whose family moved to Oxford, Ohio? Yep, it was Reverend John Scott with his family. Seeing each other again, Benjamin would begin his courtship of Carrie. They were married on October 20th, 1853, in the Scott home in Oxford, with Carrie's father, the Reverend John Scott, performing the ceremony. Benjamin would pass the Ohio law exam in 1854. Now he was able to start practicing law. The Harrisons felt that the hustle-bustle of the big city of Cincinnati wasn't really what they wanted. Indianapolis was a smaller city, but it was growing, and it took them further west. They would move to Indianapolis in 1854. Benjamin's priority was getting his law practice going and making a living for his family. His first child, Russell, was born August 12, 1854. In 1857, Benjamin was elected Indianapolis City Attorney with an annual salary of $400. On April 3, 1858, their daughter Mary, or as they would call her, Mamie, was born. Also in 1858, Benjamin entered into a partnership with William Wallace to form the law office of Wallace and Harrison. In 1860, Harrison was elected reporter of the Indiana Supreme Court. Wallace would be elected county clerk, so Benjamin began a new firm with William Fishback and Harrison. April 12, 1861, began the American Civil War. Benjamin didn't join the military at this time because he was concerned about his young family, and most people thought the war would only last a few months anyway. Boy, were they wrong. 1862. The war was still raging. President Lincoln would ask the North for more soldiers. This time, Benjamin would enlist, and Indiana Governor Morton asked Benjamin if he would help recruit a regiment. He would recruit throughout northern Indiana. Morton commissioned Benjamin as a colonel on August 7, 1862, with the 70th Indiana Infantry, which was mustered into federal service on August 12th. Once mustered, the regiment left Indiana to join the Union Army at Louisville, Kentucky. Benjamin would train his men hard during the day, and at night he would read books on warfare and the training of troops. The 70th Indiana would fight at the Battle of Resaca and Peachtree Creek, May and July of 1864. Colonel Harrison would lead his men into battle with the catchphrase, "Come on, boys!" He earned the reputation of being a strong leader and as an officer who did not abandon his men in battle. The 70th was also involved in the Siege of Atlanta that concluded on September 2, 1864. Following the surrender of Atlanta, Governor Morton sent for Colonel Harrison to leave his men and return to Indiana for special duty. While in Indiana, he campaigned for the position of Indiana's Supreme Court reporter and for President Lincoln's re-election. After the election, he would return to the war. Because of his success at the battles of Resaca and Peachtree Creek, President Lincoln nominated Colonel Harrison to the grade of Brevet Brigadier General. The Senate confirmed the nomination on February 14, 1865. After the war, Benjamin returned to practicing law. He would be known as one of the state's leading lawyers. 1874 to 1875, the Harrison home was built on Delaware Street. This would be his home for the rest of his life, and the house is still standing to this day. 1876, he runs for governor, but he loses. In 1881, he was elected to the U.S. Senate by the Indiana State Legislature. In 1887, he would not be re-elected to the Senate. There's a true story that I want to tell you about Benjamin's father, John Scott. He had been a farmer at the Point, which was located next to his father, William Henry Harrison's farm. He had served 2 terms in Congress representing the state of Ohio. Afterwards, he went back to his home and went back to being a farmer. He would pass away on May 25, 1878. His burial was on May 29th in the Congress Green Cemetery, which is now the William Henry Harrison Tomb State Memorial. And he was buried alongside the tomb of his father, William Henry Harrison, who had been the 9th President of the United States. At this time, there were rumors going around North Bend of people called resurrectionists. They were considered ghouls who would disturb the graves of those recently buried and stealing the bodies to sell to the nearby medical colleges. For those of you who have never heard of such things, this really did happen. Having heard of these rumors, the Harrison family took precautions to keep such a horrific thing from happening to their father. They had the grave dug extra deep and walled up with brick. When partially filled, they placed an immense stone, which was so heavy it is said that it took 16 men to place it in the grave. Then this was covered with cement. Afterwards, they completed the burial with more dirt. The family even hired a man to guard the grave for at least a month. At the cemetery, Benjamin's brother John noticed that the grave of his friend, August Devon, who died of consumption and buried just days before, had been disturbed and the body was gone. After the funeral, John Harrison, with a nephew, George Eaton, would travel to nearby Cincinnati in the search for Devon's body. It was not until the next morning that they were able to obtain their search warrant. At 3 a.m., the morning after the funeral, and John and George were waiting for their search warrant, it was noticed that a buggy had driven into the alley that would take it to the back of the medical college. The buggy stopped, something was taken out, and then disappeared. Afterwards, the buggy left in a hurry. For those who had witnessed this event, they thought that another body had just been smuggled into the Ohio Medical College. When John and George arrived at the Ohio Medical College later, they were accompanied by 3 police officers. They searched everywhere, looking into every room, opened up every box and barrel. In the cellar was found a chute which led from the gate opening in the alley, and this chute ran from the cellar to the top of the 5-story building. This is where the bodies would be delivered, and then the bodies would be pulled upwards using what was called a windlass to the dissecting rooms above. This is a type of winch for lowering and raising of things. Detective Snellbaker, who was one of the 3 police officers that were with John and George, had become suspicious of the janitor. The janitor had left the group stating that he felt the officers of the college should be present. Snellbaker had him followed, and instead of going for the faculty, he went to another room upstairs. Realizing that he was being followed, the janitor went back and rejoined the 5 men. Needless to say, Harrison, Eaton, and the policeman went upstairs to check out the room where the janitor had been headed. They found boxes, bundles of papers, and all sorts of things, but they didn't find the body. In the far corner of the room was a windlass and rope. The rope ran down into the chute that went to the cellar. Snellbaker felt the rope and realized that there was a body at the end of it. He would turn the crank to bring up the body. The grave clothes had been removed, but the head and shoulders were covered. After looking at the body, Harrison would say that this was not Devon, because Devon died of tuberculosis and the body would be more emaciated. He was now ready to leave the room when Snellbaker urged him to look at the face just to be sure. The detective told him that he might be mistaken and never forgive himself later for letting this moment pass. John felt that it was not really necessary, and he was ready to get out of there, but he agreed to look because Snellbaker insisted upon it. With the body out of the chute and on the floor, John Harrison lifted the covering from the face, and someone said, "It's an old man." John bent down to get a closer look, then his face went pale and he seemed about to fall. The detective stepped closer to help support him, and he asked, "What's the matter?" As John stood in a state of shock, supporting himself on the arm of the detective, he would finally say, "It's Father." Yes, John Scott Harrison's body was laying upon the floor of the medical college. The grandson of a signer of the Declaration of Independence, the son of a president, a congressman himself, and the father of a much loved and respected Union general and future president, had been ripped from his grave hours after his burial. After John was over the horrific shock of finding his father like this, he sent for a coffin from a local undertaker, and the body was placed in ice for the return trip back to his burial place. Carter, another Harrison son, would arrive in Cincinnati later in the day after finding the empty grave of their father, where he would find his brother and nephew at the depot with the news that the body had been found. General Benjamin Harrison would arrive later from Indianapolis. When the hired guard was asked how this could have happened when he was watching over the grave, he would tell the family that he hadn't seen or heard anything. I would say that he was either not even there, sound asleep, or bribed to look the other way. The Harrison family hired the Pinkerton Agency of Chicago to work alongside Detective Snellbaker in bringing the criminals to justice. For those of you who are like me and want to know if August Devon's body was ever found, it was. Detective Snellbaker found his body at a medical college in Ann Arbor, Michigan. A family member of Devon's, along with George Eaton, would travel to Michigan to identify the body. Devon's body was returned to North Bend. Indicted was resurrectionist Dr. Charles Morton and the janitor for the Ohio Medical College, J.Q. Marshall. The institutions were not held accountable, so General Harrison and Joseph C. Devon brought a civil suit against the medical schools. Here is the Harrison family: Benjamin with his wife Carrie, his son Russell, and daughter Mamie. In the year 1888, something big was going to happen to Benjamin. In 1888, Grover Cleveland was president, and he was up for re-election. Tariffs were a main concern for voters in 1888. Cleveland wanted a major cut in tariffs, and he was opposed to Civil War veterans receiving pensions. Benjamin was on the side of the industrialists and the factory workers, and he was also a strong proponent for pensions for Civil War veterans. The Republican convention was held in Chicago, and Benjamin was in Indianapolis working. It was on the 8th ballot that he would become the nominee. When Benjamin received the telegram that he was the nominee, it is said that he nearly fainted. By the time he returned home, there was an unbelievable crowd gathered outside celebrating, because Indiana's own Ben Harrison was the Republican nominee for president. Voting was on November 6th, and on November 7th, General Benjamin Harrison from Indianapolis, Indiana, was the president-elect. He was elected as the 23rd President of the United States. Benjamin Harrison was sworn in on March 4, 1889, at the East Portico of the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. It was raining that day, just like it had when his grandfather was inaugurated, and Benjamin, being very aware of what happened to his grandfather, was dressed for the weather. His speech was only an hour long, and Grover Cleveland held an umbrella for him as he spoke. When the Harrisons moved into the White House, they found that it needed some big improvements. There were rats, sewage problems, and cramped living quarters. The First Lady would go to Congress and ask for money to make needed repairs and improvements. Congress would turn her down. She just kept going back, asking for the needed funds until Congress finally gave in. They would give her an amount that today would be around $1 million. Carrie spent the money very wisely. She worked on the rat situation. She would have electricity installed in the White House, even though both the Harrisons would not touch the light switches for fear of electrocution. So other staff would be the ones who would turn the lights off and on. The Lincoln White House china would be discovered, boxed up, and forgotten. The First Lady was a woman of many talents, and one of her talents was painting. She would design the china that was used during her husband's presidency. Carrie incorporated the eagle that was used on the Lincoln china, and the design for the trim around the plates was corn, in honor of their home state of Indiana. She established the tradition that each administration would have their own individual pattern on the White House china. Johns Hopkins University Medical School approached the First Lady to help with fundraising, which she agreed to on one condition: that they would allow women to attend their school. Almost all of the names of those appointed to the Harrison cabinet would be unknown to us today, but there is one that almost all of us, if not all of us, would recognize. He would appoint New Yorker Theodore Roosevelt as the Civil Service Commissioner. Teddy Roosevelt would become the 26th President of the United States. During his presidency, 6 new states were added to the Union, more than any other president before or since. North and South Dakota, Montana, and Washington became states in November of 1889, and Idaho and Wyoming became states in July of 1890. Items from the Harrison presidency. He passed the Dependent and Disability Pension Act in 1890. Also passed was the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Land Revision Act of 1891. Harrison authorized the first forest reserve to be located on public domain adjacent to Yellowstone National Park, and by the end of his term, he would designate 22 million acres for forest reservations. He updated the Navy. When taking office, President Harrison had found that the Navy had only 2 warships, and within a year he had congressional approval for the building of 4 new warships with the best technology of the day. They were the Indiana, Texas, Oregon, and Columbia. He would also establish the Pan American Union and would pass the Meat Inspection Act. The first crisis that Harrison had to face had to deal with the Aleutian Islands off of the coast of Alaska. Canada claimed fishing and sealing rights around many of the Aleutian Islands in violation of U.S. law. The U.S. Navy seized several Canadian ships, and in 1891 the administration began negotiations with the British. And eventually, with the benefit of international arbitration, a compromise over the fishing rights was reached, and Britain would pay compensation. Then, there was an issue with the country of Chile. The relations between our 2 countries was already strained when, in 1891, sailors of the USS Baltimore took shore leave in Valparaiso. The sailors and the locals would get into an altercation where 2 American sailors were killed and 3 dozen were arrested. When the captain of the Baltimore examined the wounds on his sailors, he insisted that the Chilean police killed them by an unprovoked bayonet attack. The president drafted a demand for reparations, to which the Chilean Minister of Foreign Affairs said that the president's message was erroneous and deliberately incorrect, and would say that the Chilean government was treating the affair the same as any other criminal matter. Our countries were at the brink of war, and President Harrison threatened to break diplomatic relations unless the U.S. received a suitable apology, and said that the situation required grave and patriotic consideration. The Navy was put on high alert. The Chileans would agree to unconditional concessions and apologize, keeping us from going to war. A few more things you may not know about President Harrison. President Harrison was the centennial president. He was inaugurated 100 years after George Washington's inauguration. He was the first president to have a decorated Christmas tree in the White House. He was the first president to have electric lights. And during his presidency in 1892, Ellis Island opened to new immigrants. Harrison was nominated for a second term in 1892, even though he did not have the full support of the Republican Party. The Democrats once again nominated Grover Cleveland. In the summer of 1892, it was found that Carey had tuberculosis. Grover Cleveland would meet with President Harrison to let him know that he realized what a difficult time this was for him. He would suggest that both men agree to not do any campaigning. They would shake on it. Cleveland was a man of his word and did not campaign. Harrison would take Carey to their vacation home in the Adirondack Mountains, hoping the fresh air would help her get better. By the time they returned to Washington in September, there was no doubt that Carey was dying. Carolyn Scott Harrison would pass away on October 25th, 2 weeks before the election. The funeral and burial were in Indianapolis. Grover Cleveland would win the 1892 election. President Harrison would stay in Washington until the inauguration. Then he would return to Indianapolis, back to the home he and Carey had made and loved, but without the woman he had loved for so many years. I actually think it was a good thing that he was not reelected. I'm sure he needed time to go home and mourn and not have to worry about the daily struggles of running a country. Benjamin was on friendly terms with Carey's niece Mary, who was a widow. For 2 years they had a friendly correspondence because Mary lived in New York. Then, the next 2 years, the letters would change from friendly to romantic. In December of 1895, Benjamin would announce his engagement to Mary. When he wrote to Russell, he would tell him basically that he no longer wanted to be alone. Both of his children were very unhappy when they heard the news. And the thing that bothered them the most was that Mary was younger than Benjamin's daughter Mamie. They would marry in 1896, and Russell and Mamie would not attend. Benjamin and Mary would have a daughter in 1897 and name her Elizabeth after both of their mothers. In February of 1901, Benjamin would get sick. At first, the doctors thought it was the flu and believed that he would recover. Later, it was realized that he had pneumonia, and the doctors would come to realize that he was not going to survive. On March 13, 1901, he would die of pneumonia at his home in Indianapolis. He was 67 years old. It is said that his last words were, "Are the doctors here? Doctor, my lungs." Benjamin Harrison's body was taken to the state capitol on March 16th and viewed by thousands of mourners. The funeral was held on March 17th. President McKinley came in from Washington, D.C. to attend the funeral of his friend. He was honored with a funeral fitting a man of his accomplishments. Benjamin Harrison was buried in Crown Hill Cemetery and was laid to rest by his first wife, Carey. Mary, his second wife, died in 1948, and she too would be buried next to her late husband. The cemetery does have markers to lead you to the gravesite for those who are interested in visiting. Shown are quotes from Benjamin Harrison. One that shows his love of this country says, "Do not be ashamed to love the flag or confess your love of it. Make much of it, tell its history, sing of it." Be sure to visit the Benjamin Harrison Presidential site at his home on Delaware Street. I visited several weeks ago and truly enjoyed my visit. You can see thousands of items that belong to the Harrison family. Paintings, portraits, pictures, furniture, the White House china, the piano where Carrie would play and sing, the easel where she would paint, the parlor where the family spent many happy hours. You also get to enter Benjamin's study. In there, you will be able to hear a recording of his voice. It is hard to understand, but you do get to hear him speak. This recording made him the first president to ever have been recorded. These historical markers stand in front of the presidential site. As you will see, the marker doesn't say president, but instead it shows Brigadier General. Apparently, Benjamin Harrison preferred being called General more than being called President. And with the many good things that Carrie did, she served as the first President General of the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution from 1890 to her death. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed learning about Indiana's President, Benjamin Harrison, and his First Lady, Carrie. Be sure to subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment if you would like. Be sure to click on the notification bell so that you will be notified when the next Hoosier History, Legends, and Heroes video is uploaded. Until next time,